Mr. Daniel Blair is the Deputy Inspector General for Auditing for the Department of Defense. Mr. Matthew Bibe is the Deputy Senior Acquisition Executive for the Defense Logistics Agency. Mr. William Kenney is the Acquisition Executive for Troop Support for the Defense Logistics Agency. And Mr. Gary Shifton is the Chief of the OCONUS Division of the for the Defense Logistics Agency. Pardon me there. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Given that you are already standing, please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated and let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow for a candid discussion and give and take here, we would ask that you would limit your testimony to 5 minutes. It's my understanding that Mr. Blair and Mr. Bibe will be offering opening statements, and that Mr. Bibe, you are representing the thoughts and perspective there of Mr. Kenney and Mr. Shifton as well. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So we will have the 2 opening statements, and then we will go to questions. So, Mr. Blair, we will recognize you now for 5 minutes.
Chairman Chaffetz, Ranking Member Tierney, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our completed and ongoing audits of the Supreme Prime Vendor Subsistence Contract in Afghanistan. I would also like to thank you for your continued interest and oversight in this area. Today, I will highlight some of the problems that we identified during our initial audit. I will describe DLA's actions to address some of our recommendations. I will identify additional opportunities to improve contract administration and discuss some lessons learned. In December 2005, DLA awarded a 5-year, $762 million contract to Supreme Food Services to provide food and other non-food distribution to 4 locations in Afghanistan. Over the next few years, this contract expanded significantly through verbal change orders to cover additional locations. In May of 2010, or by May of 2010, DLA had paid Supreme about $3 billion, including $1.6 billion for food and water and $1.4 billion for transportation and storage costs. Our initial audit of DLA's contract oversight efforts identified significant potential overpayments and contract administration flaws. For example, DLA potentially overpaid the contractor about $124 million in transportation and tri-wall costs. DLA also paid nearly $455 million to airlift food into Afghanistan without incorporating this requirement into the contract and without documenting whether the airlift price was fair and reasonable. Further, DLA failed to validate whether nearly $104 million of tri-wall costs were accurate or chargeable to the contract. And finally, DLA did not develop a quality assurance plan and detailed procedures to monitor the contractor's performance and verify that invoices being paid were accurate. During our follow-up audit, we noted that DLA had taken some corrective actions to address these problems. Because this report is not yet final, it would not be appropriate to discuss these actions in detail. However, I would like to broadly describe some of DLA's efforts. For example, DLA unilaterally definitized the price they would pay Supreme to airlift food into Afghanistan in December of 2011. This is 6 years after the verbal change order went into effect. In addition, DLA is seeking a $756 million refund from the contractor, and they have also developed a quality assurance plan. However, we also identified additional areas where DLA could further strengthen its contract oversight efforts and help the Department collect overpayments. For example, DLA could expand its efforts to develop adequate documentation supporting its conclusion that the Department is paying fair and reasonable prices. They could also take additional action to obtain critical information from contractors and develop strategies to recover overpayments. After carefully reviewing DLA's actions on this contract, several lessons learned become apparent, and today I would like to highlight 4. First, DLA should definitize contracts within the appropriate period of time, which is generally 180 days if possible. Although verbal change orders are permissible, these actions should be incorporated timely into the contract and should be used on a limited basis. Second, when using provisional rates, do not pay more than the agreed upon amounts. Paying more than provisional rates may result in escalating costs, and the Department may experience difficulty recouping these overpayments. In addition, it is important to determine that the Department is paying fair and reasonable prices for the goods and services it receives. Third, unilateral contracting officer determinations should be used sooner to protect the government's interest in the contract and begin collection efforts sooner. And finally, develop and implement a quality assurance plan and detailed procedures to monitor the contractor's performance and verify the accuracy of payments. Had DLA taken this important step, then they would have prevented many of the overpayments from being made in the first place. In closing, I would like to thank the subcommittee for inviting me to testify today. It is clear that our audit efforts and related recommendations to collect overpayments are having an impact on the Department. We are encouraged by the actions and efforts of DLA senior leadership, especially those efforts to collect the amounts that are owed to the Department. However, to be truly effective, these corrective actions should be applied more broadly, as appropriate to other DLA contracts, rather than just fixing the problems that we identify. Given the fiscal challenges this country is facing, every reasonable effort should be taken to save valuable funds and put them to their best possible use. This concludes my statement today, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have for me.
Thank you, Mr. Blair. We will now recognize Mr. Bibe for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tierney, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am Matt Bibe, Deputy Director of Acquisition for the Defense Logistics Agency. I am delivering the opening statement today on behalf of DLA. We appreciate the opportunity to appear here today to discuss DLA's award to Supreme Food Service for the Subsistence Prime Vendor Afghanistan contract. As the Department of Defense's only combat logistics support agency, DLA's primary mission is to support American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. DLA provides virtually every consumable item our military forces require, including food, fuel, medical supplies, uniform items, and weapons system repair parts. As the Deputy Director for DLA Acquisition, I am responsible for the DLA's acquisition program. With me today is Mr. Bill Kenney, the DLA Troop Support Acquisition Executive, and Mr. Gary Shifton, the DLA Troop Support Subsistence Supplier Operations Division Chief. In 2004, DLA received a directive from the Army to provide subsistence support to service members deployed to Operation Enduring Freedom. DLA issued a fully competitive solicitation in October 2004 and awarded the contract to Supreme Food Service in June 2005. The contract provides full-service food and non-food distribution support in Afghanistan and expires in December 2013. As awarded, the contract was written to use ground transportation for delivery to 4 sites in Afghanistan. Requirements there quickly changed, with the military setting up many more forward operating bases than initially planned. 2 months after contract award, DLA Troop Support issued a verbal change order to Supreme to support a significant increase in forward operating bases using a combination of ground, fixed-wing aircraft, and helicopters to make deliveries. This is referred to as premium outbound transportation. In December 2005, Supreme submitted proposed premium outbound transportation rates. These proposed rates represent the main area of disagreement between DLA and Supreme. In June 2006, after performing on the contract for 6 months, Supreme billed DLA for premium outbound transportation using those proposed rates. That same month, DLA requested an audit from the Defense Contract Audit Agency to determine whether Supreme's rates were fair and reasonable. DLA also issued a contract modification to establish that Supreme would be reimbursed monthly at 75% of the existing rate. DCAA audits conducted in 2008 and 2011 were unable to confirm the reasonableness of Supreme's in-theater transportation rates. In August 2010, during contract negotiations, DLA Troop Support issued a contract modification to further reduce the payment rate from 75% to approximately 50%. After unsuccessful negotiations and following completion of the 2011 audit, DLA unilaterally definitized the prices for premium outbound transportation. As a result, the contracting officer determined Supreme owed the government $756.9 million and sent a final decision letter to Supreme in December 2011. Supreme has appealed this decision to the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals. As of March 31, 2013, DLA has received approximately $283 million and continues to collect more than $21 million per month. Throughout the Supreme contract, DLA has ensured continuous subsistence support to the military forces in Afghanistan. We acknowledge the issues associated with the DoD Inspector General's 2011 audit and have worked diligently to address these findings. We understand DLA must achieve both unwavering warfighter support and thorough contract management. We take very seriously our obligations to the American taxpayer and our stewardship responsibilities. We look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bibe, was there any dispute about the quality of the product or the actual food that they were delivering? Was there any dispute about any of that?
No, there was not.
Is it fair to characterize the only question or problems or challenges that you saw were purely contracting questions?
Related to rates, yes, sir.
Related to rates. And does Supreme still offer food services in Afghanistan to this day?
They are still our provider of food in Afghanistan.
So you have a situation where you sign a contract and literally weeks, or you can qualify it as 2 months, I believe it was, after that contract's signed, you have to renegotiate. Things are changing rapidly.
Yes, sir. The original contract was not negotiated. It was a competitively bid contract. But, yes, we then had to enter into a situation where requirements changed, which would then require a negotiation.
Were they the low bid contract?
Let me defer to Mr. Shifton.
Mr. Shifton, were they the low bid contract?
They were. My recollection is they were not the low bid contract. They had the best technical proposal, and we used a trade-off process for awards. So they had a technically superior proposal to the competitor 7Cs.
There was only one other bidder?
Yes.
So you get into this contract, you're 2 months into it, you got to change the you issue verbal orders, and then you start getting into a spat about, or a dispute about what are the rates. Why is that a verbal, this is not like, hey, this is not $5. We're talking about an awful lot of money. Why is this a verbal agreement?
The primary priority was to ensure we had uninterrupted service, food service to the warfighter in Afghanistan. That was our primary responsibility while ensuring that we take proper actions within the contract management.
So you're moving ahead. You have this dispute that is hundreds of millions of dollars, and yet you went ahead and extended their contract by billions. Why is that?
Mr. Chairman, may I take that question?
Mr. Kennedy?
Sir, as Mr. Bibe indicated, our primary focus of the subsistence contracting team was to maintain that exceptional level of service to the men and women serving in Afghanistan. We extended that. The use of unpriced actions, sole source contracts, verbal change orders is highly unusual, rarely used in the contracting process. We discourage its use. In fact, we have no unpriced contracting actions currently at the Troop Support Center. In this case, there was a decision made because of the dynamics and the requirements of the warfighter that we needed to take some unusual action. The reason that we extended that contract on one and several occasions was we were attempting to put together an acquisition strategy and an acquisition plan that encompassed not only the lessons learned over the last 3-4 years of dealing with Supreme, but struck that balance between effectiveness and efficiency. We developed and refined that strategy over a period of time. We did that with changing requirements, numbers of troops, troop surge, troops drawdowns. Where we're going to have the issues associated with fraud that we saw with PwC. We incorporated things like a code of business ethics into the new solicitation. So the solicitation.
Why does that? It's not like we just went to war for the first time. I mean, we spent an awful lot of time in Iraq, and we've been in Afghanistan now, 10-plus years.
Yes, sir.
That wasn't part of the original thing, a code of ethics?
Sir, there was a lot of lessons learned that came out of the PwC investigation.
Well, my concern is I wonder if we actually learn these lessons. That's the thing. I just struggle with why so late in the process this happens, and I just don't understand why this just isn't. You say that these lessons are learned. You say that sole bids are an exception. You say that we don't generally do verbal adjustments. That's not my experience. That's not my perspective. It scares me that you think that.
Well, sir, I can only speak for the troop support with all due respect as far as what we learned from the PwC justice investigations. We then took and educated and enhanced our training for our workforce and the provisions within our contracts.
Were you short of personnel? Did you not have enough people? What was the problem?
Sir, from my perspective, the contract management efforts that we applied to this did not keep pace with the changes that we were seeing in our requirements. We have made significant changes to that since that time.
Mr. Blair, I just want to give you an opportunity to share some comments or perspective on this discussion that we're having right here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that I alluded to in my statement was another report that we issued last year, and this is our contingency contracting report, and this is an update report. And what we found is some of the same issues that we see here in the Supreme contract are the same issues that we find quite often in our audits, and it really relates to contract oversight and inadequate contract oversight. It relates to inadequate invoice reviews, and so those are our top two areas that's highlighted in this report. And I do think that had that level of oversight been in effect from day one when this contract started, and had it kept pace with the contract, I think DLA would not be in the position that it's in at this point. That's a critical part of basic oversight for a contract, especially a contract of this complexity and this magnitude.
Well, thank you. And again, we don't seem to learn these lessons. And I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Cherney, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Shifton, where's Ms. DeBail?
My understanding, Mr. Dale works out of an office in Virginia.
She's no longer doing the same responsibility she had at the outset of this
I'm sorry, I misspoke. You said Ms. DeMayo?
DeMayo. Right.
Ms. DeMayo is working in our medical directorate at Troop Support.
Right. Was she responsible for the original contract on this, or were you?
She was the contracting officer. I was her supervisor.
All right. So tell me how it is that you have an original contract that I assume dealt with terms, scope, price, and cost, right?
That's correct.
Right. And you approved all of that?
Yes, I had oversight of all that.
That contract called for documentation from the Supreme Company to document all of the work and bills that they submitted to you?
Well, sir, there's two parts of this. The first part is the award that was made to Supreme was a FAR Part 12 competitive award. The second part of this is the premium outbound transportation.
All right. Well, I'm dealing with the original contract, all right? 4 bases.
4 bases.
All right. You set it on that. You set your price. You set your scope. You set your terms on all of that. Did anywhere in that contract to say that when you submit a bill, we also want to see all the backup documentation for how it is that you got to negotiate this price?
Sir, not really. It was a competitive acquisition, so we're really doing price analysis against the bidders.
All right. So you had 2 bidders. And you decided to go with the one with no experience?
No, we went with the one that actually had the better technical experience than the other one.
What did the other one have? I mean, what is technical experience?
They actually were operating in Afghanistan. They had experience moving product inside Afghanistan. The other had a template to do that type of work, but had not performed it inside Afghanistan.
Except that Mr. Schuster testified that they hadn't been doing exactly the same work that they were doing here. So it was an approximation of the same type of work?
I would say that's fair, yes.
Okay. So at some point you decide before the contract even starts that you now have to jump this up to 68 additional bases.
Yes. Can I explain?
You were just informed by somebody else that you had to do it, right?
Right. Typically, once the contract is awarded, almost immediately thereafter, we host a post-award conference where the customers, in this case the Army, comes in, troop support, and the vendor meet. There's also a ramp-up period to this contract. And one of the reasons why the decision was made back in August, a couple months after the contract was awarded, is we had to eliminate a supply chain to the Army and their distribution support and make a decision then that Supreme would have to adjust for that in their supply chain. That's why we had to make that type of decision back in August, so we would not have two duplicate supply chains moving into Afghanistan.
So you're telling me that you couldn't let Supreme do the 4 bases and have the Army continue to do the remaining bases?
Right. The Army's support of those bases primarily came out of 2 what they call Class 1 yards or subsistence yards, one at Bagram, one at Kandahar. And routinely, by the time the product from those yards got to the forward operating locations, there was spoilage. And the Army had a lot of problems at that time storing subsistence-type product and getting it out to forward locations. So they came to us to see if it was viable to support those in our contract.
What additional documentation did you require of Supreme to determine that they were qualified to do the 68 additional bases?
I can't say it was so much probably documentation other than Supreme acknowledged that they could do the support.
They gave you their word. Is that the way you generally do contract business? 68 additional bases, billions of dollars, they give you a word, oh, we can do it, don't worry?
Sir, no, it's not. And we formalized that subsequent to that. In the late, although in 2006, we developed what's called a delivery support plan request for every single location in Afghanistan.
And how late in 2006 was that?
It was in the later part.
All right. So that's a year into the contract, in the extended part of the contract. So in 2005, when you asked them to do the additional 68 bases and then more, what did they tell you they were going to charge you for it?
At that time, the decision was made is that what they were going to charge us for would be subject to audit.
So nothing. They just said, we'll do it, we'll get an audit, and we'll do it later.
Right. And then they...
And that was fine with you?
Again, at the time, there was a limit to the amount of information we had in this type of support in Afghanistan. But to answer your question, we accepted it. Again, with the conditions that it would be subject to audit.
Well, why didn't you immediately ask for an audit on fair and reasonableness right at that time in 2005?
Because at that point, we did not have any actuals that would be supportable by an audit.
So it was a complete flying thing. We're going to go for several months here just winging it, hoping that it all comes into something reasonable, and then in the middle of 2006, you get whacked with a $33.5 million bill that puts the hair on your head straight up, right?
Again, we were, yeah, I mean, obviously, work inside Afghanistan, there was...
Who's telling you you have to do this on this flimsy... Mr. Kenney, are you approving all of this?
Sir, I did not personally approve that, but maybe I can...
Well, is it your department that did? I mean, Mr. Shifton is out there, and he's closest one to the line here next to Mr. Mayo, who is not with us today for whatever reason. So he's got to make some hard decisions. Somebody's telling him he's got to get these 68 bases served, and he's got to take some other company's word for it without having any documentation, any estimates based on anything in particular. It's got to be coming from your office, right?
Well, sir, if I may, my review of the documents of the sequence of events here, yes, that verbal change order did take place. It was followed by a modification. I believe it was modification 10 that the Chairman identified.
What was the date of that? Late 2006?
That's correct.
That's my point. My point is you're a year into this thing. You've taken a flyer for a year as to what is going to be a price on this thing, in no way of establishing what it is, taking their word for they're going to be able to perform the contract, and we'll all get to a price later on. Mr. Blair, how should that have been handled?
Mr. Tierney, according to the regulations, it should have been done within 180 days, if possible.
Do you think it was possible?
That would be speculation on my part.
Well, no, you've reviewed it. You're the Inspector General. You made a recommendation that it should have been done within 180 days. Did you think it was possible?
I think there are efforts that could have been taken to be more aggressive.
What will those efforts be?
Well, I have kind of a simplistic view, since I'm not an attorney, when it comes to contracting actions. But in my view, if you withhold payment on current or future amounts, if you issue a demand letter or a cure notice, you are starting to leverage and take additional action, more aggressive action, rather than waiting a year.
You're going to pull the plug on me. Go ahead, and I'll pick it up afterwards.
Now recognize the gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you very much. First of all, gentlemen, thank you for your service. I mean, I have some appreciation of how tough it is. We've got the troops out there, and they got to get the water, they got to get the bullets. It's tough, but we've got a bad system when this kind of stuff happens. But I do appreciate your service. In June of 2010, 5 years after the performance started, the contracting officer finally realized that DLA was never going to be able to negotiate fair and reasonable rates with Supreme and recommended unilaterally definitizing the contract. The price negotiating memoranda stated the contracting officer believes an agreement will never be reached, and therefore premium outbound transportation should be unilaterally definitized. Mr. Shifton, were you involved in the contracting officer's decision to recommend that unilateral act in June of 2010?
Yes.
Did you concur with his recommendation?
Yes.
But on July 9, 2010, the Procurement and Integrity and Pricing Division notified the contracting officer that it disagreed with the recommendation and instead recommended that the contracting officer request a new DCAA audit through August 2010. And to the best of your knowledge, why was that recommendation that was made, and you agreed with, to definitize the contract in June 2010 overturned?
Yeah, sir, what it was decided was that the data to definitize in June of 2010 was primarily based on events that happened during 2006 and 2007 and part of 2008. It was decided that it would be more advantageous to us and to the contracting officer to then actually have more actual data of events that happened, more flight information, more pounds transported, more fixed wings of product moved, to have more recent and relevant data to come up with a decision, because the conditions on the ground had changed so much and the volumes were so much higher. They thought it was in our best interest to seek another audit.
Well, that's interesting. When you say in our best interest, was it in our best interest in terms of getting a fair price, or was it in our best interest in terms of no readily available alternative to get to our troops what they needed, and we just had to bite the bullet and get shafted for a few years more?
I think it was a combination decision at the time. In recognizing of not getting shafted, we reduced the rates down to 50%, vice the 75%. And again, it was a determination that for us to be in our best position, in our best negotiation position, to have a new audit based on the most recent data.
Okay. Well, you know, at that time when the original recommendation was made, it was $682 million, which is a lot of money. But when DLA finally definitized the contract in December of 2011, the overpayment had swelled to $757 million, you know, an extra $75 million hit on the taxpayer. Mr. Bibe and Mr. Kennedy, what's your views on that? Do you think we made the right decision? I mean, I understand it's a tough decision and there's a lot of competing things you have to do, but somehow, some way, it seems that these contractors just get away with, you know, Willie Sutton-style larceny.
Sir, if I may, my perspective on this matter, we've heard about the contract being awarded was a FAR Part 12 contract. I think it's important to note to the committee that the contract modification that included, that authorized, premium authorized pot, if you would, premium transportation, was using the authority of FAR Part 31. What FAR Part 31 required of Supreme was to be subject to an audit and to provide the necessary documentation to support those premium authorized rates. At the time, there were numerous, as we've heard before here, sir, there were significant delays in obtaining that information, that supporting documentation, which would allow the contracting officer to make a fair and reasonable determination.
Okay.
To this day,
one question I do have, this is tough. You've got a lot of things going on, but when you've got 3 years of data, you're up to $600 or $700 million. I'm just wondering, at what point do you want to just pull the plug and put the burden on them to come forward as opposed to the burden on us where we have to let it happen for another 2 years when the evidence we have, if past this prologue, is that they'll just make it worse? I mean, that's kind of a tough call to make, but I'd like to put the burden on the bad guys.
Yes, sir, and if I may, I'm not going to question the immediate decision that Mr. Shifton and then contracting officer made. It may have been the correct immediate decision, but to Mr. Blair's comments, overall, the process was taking too long. There is more we probably should have done to apply leverage to the contractor, to work with DCAA, to come to another means of a conclusion, and in hindsight, we very much agree.
Okay, thank you. Just one final question. How much of a problem is it that some of the people you're dealing with at Supreme are former high-ranking Defense Department officials? Does that, as a practical matter, make it tougher? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sir, I'll just give you my perspective. I've heard the name of General Dale. I know him. I know who he is. I know General Mungin. I served under each of those individuals. I have not had any personal contact since they took their uniforms off, any correspondence, any emails, any phone calls, or any involvement in either of these contracts with either of those gentlemen.
The gentleman yield. Yeah. So would it be fair to just surmise, however, that they know just how messed up the process is at DLA and they'd be advising their client, like, just go for it because these guys aren't going to set a price. They're going to keep paying you. We're going to appeal. We're going to go on and on and on, and they know just how the process works. They didn't hire these guys to sit around and play dominoes. Is that a fair assessment of the kind of advice that somebody that had been in those positions, one was the operating manager, the other was director of the whole DLA, that they would be able to give that kind of advice to a company like Supreme as to how to go about dealing with a contract like this, whether or not they negotiated this particular contract? They could certainly tell them how the process works or doesn't work.
Sir, I'm not sure of what their roles and responsibilities are. I am aware that neither of them has a acquisition background, so whether they were able to advise the Supreme organization on how to navigate these waters, I could not comment on, sir.
I might also add, sir, and I'm not going to speculate on what they might have been advising their employers or employees, but the circumstances surrounding this particular issue is not the norm at DLA. So if they were advising based on the norm of DLA, it would not be, consistent with the findings in this particular case.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois for 5 minutes, a generous 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blair, according to your offices, DLA spent $455 million in transportation costs for local market-ready products through May of 2010 for, according to the IG report, services that were not included in the contract and were based on rates that may not be fair and reasonable. Mr. Blair, did DLA ever provide documentation to show the contracting officer how they determined the rates to be fair and reasonable?
The documentation that we received was very sketchy. So, in short, no adequate documentation was provided.
By DLA?
Correct.
Mr. Shifton, can you answer why that would have happened? Why would there not have been proper documentation?
The documentation that we provided was to support the price, was based on a price analysis that we performed, and we used U.S. Transcom's not to exceed rates. We think we have a good foundation that the work we did is acceptable for our practice and acceptable price analysis work. So we used a different contracts rates that had actual bills against it, and that's what we used to support our documentation.
Was that contract with Public Warehousing Company, Agility? Is that the contract that you used?
There was that is part of the price analysis, but not the entire part of the analysis.
Were they not subsequently, are they not subsequently being investigated, and were they not subsequently indicted?
That's correct. And again, PwC, in terms of their contract, had very little airlift connected to their contract. We used a significant amount of U.S. Transcom tenders prior to the Supreme contract, moving fresh fruits and vegetables from the United Arab Emirates into Afghanistan. The difference with the Supreme price and the Transcom tender price is the Supreme price is based on a per pound. There's 20 pounds of carrots, whereas the U.S. Transcom price is a gross weight. It's pounds and the weight of the shipping container or pallet.
So if that is the case, and if the PwC, if that contract has been indicted, why are you using them even partially as a basis for determining the rates, whether or not they're fair and reasonable under the Supreme contract?
Again, if my recollection serves me correct, we used that information back in the 2005 timeframe, whereas the indictment of PwC happened far after that. So we used information from PwC significantly prior to the indictment. And again, a significant part of our price analysis is based on the U.S. Transcom rates.
Okay. Do you disagree with Mr. Blair in his assessment that DLA did not provide adequate documentation to show how the rates to be fair and reasonable?
We concurred with the report. I think it goes back to Modification 10 was a poorly executed modification and just did not offer clarity.
So you agree that you did not provide adequate documentation to show that the price was determined to be?
Yes, we concurred with their finding.
Are you satisfied that now, that throughout the performance of their contract, DLA has paid fair and reasonable rates for those local market-ready products?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Mr. Blair, do you agree with that?
We have not yet seen the additional documentation to really hone in on those rates. So I really can't comment on that at this point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Blair, during the last hearing, we heard about allegations that Supreme was using a subsidiary of United Arab Emirates, the Jamal Ahli Food Company, or JAFCO, to seek additional profits from the government. Basically, they were billing the government, getting their profit, and then also a profit to their own subsidiary. Has your office looked into these allegations against Supreme?
No, we have not.
You have not. Okay. You're sure that you have not looked into them at all? There's no investigation underway?
If there is an investigation, I know there's an investigation. I don't know the scope of the investigation. Since I'm from audit, it really wouldn't be part of our efforts. So.
Understood. In the previous panel, Mr. Schuster stated, and I'll ask this question of both Mr. Blair and Mr. Shifton. Mr. Schuster stated that at no time did a Supreme charge DLA both a POT fee as well as a distribution fee for delivery of goods and to the FOBs. Would you agree with him on that?
No, we do not. And part of the $756 million being collected back includes that, for which we disagree with Mr. Schuster.
Mr. Blair?
The scope of our work did not really focus on the detailed billings. That was really subject to the audit work by DCAA. We focused more on the oversight efforts of DLA. So we didn't really get into that level of detail and to determine whether there was double billing or excessive billing.
Thank you.
And if I could clarify, just the portion of that of that $756 or $7 million, that credit you speak of, that overcharge, is $177 million that we're collecting back from Supreme.
Thank you, Mr. Shifton. I'm over time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize myself, and then we'll recognize Mr. Tierney, and then we will probably likely be calling votes. But if there are additional questions, we'll certainly try to entertain those. So, who's responsible? I mean, at the end of the day, my worry is blame everybody. Nobody's held responsible. Let me read. This is from March 2nd, 2011. This is the audit. It said, the subsistence contracting officials at the DLA Troop Support did not provide sufficient oversight to contracting costs and performance. Contracting officer did not adhere to certain provisions of the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the DoD supplement, or develop a quality assurance surveillance plan and written procedures to monitor contract costs and performance. Who's responsible? Who didn't do all of those things? Because, other than that, it went great. We overpaid, everybody agrees, by hundreds of millions of dollars. So who's responsible for that happening or not happening?
Sir, I will attempt to answer your question, Mr. Chairman.
I give you an A+ for being brave enough to answer that question. Thank you.
Sir, we put together a team at Troop Support in conjunction with our DLA headquarters, and we took a very thorough look at the circumstances and events surrounding the award and the execution of this contract. We looked at what corrections needed to be made, what improvements, and where we were challenged. As a result of that evaluation, there were two major themes that came out of the report. One was we needed to make adjustments to our processes to accommodate where we have a contingency operation with rapidly changing requirements. Our vehicles at the time were not flexible enough, were not agile enough to be able to accommodate the needs of the warfighter. That was number one. And number two, that we needed to do a better job in training and enhancing our education process for all our contracting professionals, whether it was in the area of contract documentation, whether it was the area of contract pricing, whether it was the need for additional contracting officer reps in country. As a result of those recommendations and as a result of that review, we felt that the need really was not so much a disciplinary action or a personnel action, but it was a need to enhance our processes and improve the education and training of our workforce to be able to deal with these types of situations in the future.
So we had been at war for 10+ years. We had been between Iraq and Afghanistan. We had made fundamental, it's hard to find what went right with this. There was nobody fired. There was nobody dismissed. Nobody was disciplined at all. Is that what you're telling me? Is that the reality?
Sir, to answer your question, that is correct. The improvements that I mentioned as far as processes, tools, making sure our folks had the IT tools to be able to monitor contract performance, having more individuals in country, and providing the necessary training so these documentation and pricing issues, if encountered in the future, we would know how to deal with them. And now we have a much broader knowledge on the right business models, how to price this. One of our major problems was we had to price this in a sole source environment with a company like Supreme. In the follow-on contracts, we brought competition into the process, which is always a major goal of the acquisition process.
But when you re-upped with Supreme, you didn't bid that out.
Sir, we did extend the contract with Supreme, and that was
but one of the conclusions was that you were going to have bids, and you didn't take any bids, right?
For the extensions, when we were building our acquisition strategy, sir, and our acquisition plan.
Your acquisition strategy is just coming at a time when we're actually not even going to be there. And that's the, that was back in 2006, right? Where you originally started to expand. You were weeks into the contract, had to expand it. It gets to be March 2nd, 2011, the IG comes out and says, look at all these problems. And 9 months later, 9 months and 7 days later, you sign a no-bid extension worth tens of billions of dollars. So how do you look me in the face and say that one of our conclusions is, well, we got to take more bids, and you didn't take any more bids?
Sir, at the time of the extension, at the time of the extensions, when the justifications and approvals were being processed, we were at that same time looking at the technical proposals received as a result of the solicitation that was issued. We, in fact, received 6 proposals, and we conducted negotiations over that period of time. Part of the time necessary for those bridges, and we wanted those bridges to come to an end, believe me, sir, but part of the time required was to do the competitive process and select a new contractor to replace Supreme.
Did you?
Yes, sir.
So you just told me that Supreme is still offering food services in Afghanistan.
Supreme is still providing the support. They will be providing support to the end to December of 2013. one of the additional reasons that those contracts had to be extended was we have significant litigation and general.
All right, let me go, we have a time crunch here. Let me recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you. All right. So we have a bill that comes in the middle of 2006 for $33.5 million, and the contracting agent officer is asked, like why they're asking for $33.5 million, which was an unauthorized commitment, and her answer was, I'm a contracting officer with an unlimited warrant, and I requested that the vendor do the work. And one of the people, Chris Caulfield, who's one of the first people to raise the alarm on this, says, this is so big it's beyond my comprehension on that. So obviously this is an unusual circumstance that everybody was dealing with here. When we inquire further from Ms. DeMayo what's going on, she said she didn't get any support that she needed at the upper levels. I spoke to quite a few individuals in policy and pricing and received much conflicting direction. No one was really eager to advise how I should proceed. I got a whole lot of, let me say this about that, but don't quote me for anything. I did my best to get some attention, but in December, January period, when I needed it most, I wasn't able to attract a whole lot. Were you the person, Mr. Shifton, was telling her that they didn't, let me say this about that, but don't quote me on anything?
No, sir.
All right. Did you give her advice to go forward or not go forward?
Yes.
All right. So she was wrong on that. She was getting all the support she could possibly need from you.
No, sir. I'm not saying that there wasn't frustration on her part of not getting more direction from other elements within troop support. There obviously
who would she go to? Because she'd go to you, you'd go to Mr. Kenney, Mr. Kenney would go to Mr. Bibe. Is that the way it runs?
Typically, for an action such as this, she would be reaching out to our support offices that give her advice in terms of contract policy and legal policy.
So have you taken any action against any of them for leaving her out there on the limb? A contracting officer who makes a decision to modify a contract verbally for $817 million, possibly as much as $2.46 billion with an email. Have you taken any of these people to task and say that's not the way you treat somebody, that's not the situation you put them in?
Sir, it's been several years since that time. I'm sure there was frustration on my part as well. Part of I think what Mr. Kenney's trying to explain, and part of if you want to consider a weakness on my part, is there was just too much focus on the operations at the time and supporting the warfighter, and just not enough focus at the time on the dotting the I's and crossing the T's.
But you had systems in place. All you had to do was run the systems. That's why they're there. Mr. Blair says, there were requirements there that if you had just tended to business, you would have asked for the proper documentation. You would have been monitoring these things as they go along. You would not have waited more than 180 days to get it done. In fact, the first time that you modified and you went to 75%, why didn't you go to 50% then?
At that time, the proposal, there's DFAR's guidance. The proposal became subject to audit, and we thought that they had a qualifying proposal which allowed 75%.
Based on what? You had no documentation. You had no comparables of any note. And you had Jim just saying, this is what we want to get paid. And you said, all right, I'll give you 75% because I'm not going to give you 100% because we got questions here, but you haven't given us enough documentation to ascertain the answer to the question.
Sir, I'm not disagreeing with you. We used, to the best of our ability, the guidance offered through DFARS.
Sir, if I may add one point.
Were you involved in this, Mr. Bibe, at all? Did people come up to you and ask you questions about this particular contract?
At the time, I was not with DLA, sir.
Okay. I don't want to be rude to you, but I appreciate you wanting to step in and help out your guys here or something, but I'm really just trying to get to the base of what happened then. So please excuse me on that. So now you have an extension coming up, $4 billion extension. You got 24 bids on that? Is that the number of people that bid on extension? How many bids did you get for the extension in 2010?
No. I think there was the acquisition that we awarded just this past June of 2012, which went to Anham. There was 6 parties that submitted offers, 4 of which were responsible bids.
So at one point in time, somebody had indicated that the reason they couldn't, they had to give a sole source no bid contract is that there wouldn't be any other responsible parties out there. But obviously there are at least 4, right?
But sir, what we did is we sought through industry with a request for information as part of the market research, this acquisition, to get industry's feedback. This is to support Afghanistan and the numbers. The infrastructure required equates to at least 90,000 pallet positions, a warehouse that has cold storage capability for almost 50 to 60,000 of those pallets. You just don't have that type of infrastructure in Afghanistan. So we wanted to give industry a chance to give feedback and to partner and to then have a plan to be able to meet the requirements of our solicitation.
I guess one of the things that makes this even worse than it does in first base is this company went in there, and by the nature of the contract, they had you by the nape of the neck because of all the things you just said. Once they were in, they got a foothold to run this out, and you didn't set the price, they were home free because they had things that you couldn't replicate fast enough to give them the boot and get them out of there, right?
I can't. I don't disagree with your analogy.
Yeah. Well,
except I would say, again, the contracting officer, we were taking action to, again, we reduced the 75% down to 50%.
Late. I mean, that would have been nice if you had done that originally, if you could save the whole bowl of money. How are you going to get the rest of the money back?
Sir, maybe I can answer that for you. Our intentions are to continue to collect the $21 million per month up until the end of the performance period of the current Supreme contract.
So you have a contract now with an unsettled price, and you're arguing about what the price should be, but based on what you are willing to pay, you're going to cut back $21 million on that and count that as savings. But you could find out that you're overpaying by that $21 million too, in which case you've got nothing back, right?
Well, sir, we believe that the fair and reasonable determination of definitizing those provisional rates, we feel that that was a correct determination by the contracting officer. We would intend to collect the balance.
But you have no documentation. Were you here to hear Mr. Tiefer from the Wartime Commission had to say? It's like an employer keeping some wasteful employee on the payroll longer than necessary in order to garnish the wages. And it smacks of that. You're keeping them around and you're going to garnish their wages, so to speak, by paying them less than the contract, but nobody knows what the contract price is, so you don't know whether you're really charging them $21 million less or $10 million less or too much. We're all still out here in this gray netherland, right?
Well, again, the basis of the rates that we took unilateral action, and much of that is supported by the DCA audit, and the rates are what the government has determined as being fair and reasonable at this time, and that is what Supreme is being paid, and that's the credit we're collecting back.
Mr. Bibe, how is it that you let this whole thing unravel? Were you not there at the time? It would be fair to you.
I personally wasn't, but I certainly will speak for DLA, sir.
You don't need to. That's right. You weren't there. I'm not. Mr. Kennedy, you were there through this whole enterprise?
Sir, I was there from September of 2010 on.
So you weren't there. Mr. Shifter, you're the only one left holding the bag, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. Well, I can't ask you to answer it. I mean, basically, I understand the position you're in. You've made that clear. I get a sense of where Mr. Mayo is. I'd like to know where the people that were in Mr. Kennedy's position, Mr. Bibe's commission, were in terms of carrying out the rules and regulations and seeing that you did and Mr. Mayo did.
Yeah.
And hopefully Mr. Blair's work is going to result in going forward and giving us a template so that we don't end up in this situation again. Thank you all for your testimony.
Thank the gentleman. We'll recognize the gentleman from Illinois very briefly as we have a vote on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will be very brief. Mr. Shifton, the contracting officer who was the contracting officer for all this, who is not here today, not only was this person not disciplined in any way, according to your testimony, what kind of an evaluation did you give this person over the years that she supervised this contract?
I'm sure I gave her a high rating.
You gave her a very high rating.
Yes, I did.
Did you give her a bonus on in those years?
Yes, she annually received a monetary
a bonus for good work, right?
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Shifton, so have you had problems? I'm sorry, Mr. Kinney, how long have you been with DLA in this, since 2010?
I assumed the role of the acquisition executive for DLA troop support in September of 2010.
In 2010. Okay. So excuse me. So when the original contract expired in December 2010, instead of rebidding the contract, DLA granted Supreme the non-competitive extension through December of 2012, And then in June of 2012, DLA granted Supreme another sole source extension lasting from December 2012 to December 2013. So you were there for that period?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you give Mr. Shifton an excellent rating or a high rating in his performance?
Ma'am, I'm not the rating official for Mr. Shifton.
Okay. Did you receive a high performance rating, Mr. Shifton, during this period?
Yes.
Did you receive bonuses all these years that this has been going on during this period?
Yes, I did.
Do you think that both you and this contracting officer, who have now led DLA into this situation where you're almost $1 billion in overpayments, you think that type of performance warrants high ratings and bonuses?
Well, obviously,
yes or no?
Yes, because I gave Marianne an award, but again, her job is much more, it has much more comprehensive than this area.
So everything else, it's almost $1 billion. This is what boggles the mind for me. I rated people in the Federal Government myself. I rated soldiers in the civilian sector. If you went out and you blew almost $1 billion of your company's money, you would be fired. You would at the very least be demoted. You certainly wouldn't be given an excellent rating and a bonus. And this is what you've done with this contractor year after year, and you yourself have been compensated. No wonder the problem continues. I don't see anybody suffering the consequences. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Don't apologize. I concur. I appreciate your passion on this issue. I share it. And listen, gentlemen, we appreciate your testimony here today. We have a vote on the floor. We will continue to pursue this. We would appreciate your responsiveness in responding to questions, further questions and inquiries that we have. And we thank you. The committee stands adjourned.